بسم الله والحمد لله والصلاة والسلام على رسول الله. يا ربنا زدنا علما وتقوى وبارك في أوقاتنا وفي أقوالنا وفي أفعالنا وتقبل منا ولا تأخذنا بقصورنا ولا بذنوبنا. لقد ظلمنا أنفسنا ولا غافر لذنوبنا أنت، فنتوجه إليك ونعتمد عليك ونتوكل عليك ونستغفرك ونتوب إليك. I wanted to talk about the importance of refocusing the dawah. The case in Philadelphia serves as a good point of focus in talking about reorienting the dawah. I'm talking about the case of the young boy who comes from a Muslim family who was charged or is being charged in the murder of the 73-year-old man in Philadelphia. One of the things that was a buzz term or concept for a while in the Muslim community was the need to focus on the youth. That was something that was constantly a point of thought in the minds of many, and it became something which opened up the idea of creating youth coordinator programs or positions in masajid. But what we find is that some of the hype that we saw at one time, it completely died off. And before, we used to see more effort placed in the idea of Boy Scouts in youth programs and youth activities. And even that, in many instances, it waned, it died out. And I was mentioning this issue. I was talking about the priorities of da'wah in the live that I did a little earlier, with regard to how people talk about Philadelphia and using Philadelphia as a case study. First of all, I have some interest in it because it's a city that I was born in and I was raised in. But it also serves us well to study the way that it is that Islam is unfolding, or the Muslim community is unfolding itself in that context. That's something that is extremely important. In reality, the dawah in many instances has to focus itself on the youth in that type of environment, if it is the case that there will be continuity with Islam, if it's the case that Islam will continue to exist after generations in a healthy way. A lot of the youth are struggling because of the breakdown in family. And so that's why I was saying in the other live that a lot of times we get into this whole issue of the problem of parents and parents not being responsible. But sometimes parents are at a point where they have no real control over their children. And it's not necessarily the case that it is because they're bad parents. We look at the prophets and we find, for instance, in the case of Yaqub alayhi salatu wasalam, he had children that plotted to kill one of his own sons. The brothers of Yusuf plotted to kill their brother. And so we can find examples wherein children can go one route and the parents are on another path. So there is no necessary relationship between children being bad and the parents being bad. Sometimes children, they carve their own paths. But we do have an idea in prophetic teaching that environment, others, people's influence the development of our youth. Right? We have that hadith that indicates to us that every child is born into a state of Islam. And then by way of outside influences, that child begins to change. One of the things that I found to be extremely beneficial was the thinking that came from some intellectuals within the black community, wherein they talked about the importance of education. Some of us are old enough to remember books that were published by people like Jawanza Kunjufu, and how he talked about children, and he talked about their development and the problems in child rearing, and how it is that specifically black children were being left behind. And we also know about the work of people like Dr. Amos Wilson, in which Dr. Amos Wilson had talked in specifically about black children and their unique needs. Those black-centered intellectuals opened up for us the understanding that child psychology and education, as is practiced in the whole of the society, may not be beneficial for certain communities. And so therein, they point to us the importance of having our own thoughts, whether we're Palestinian, whether we're Latino, whether we're African American, but within the umbrella of Islam overall, more specifically, we begin to realize that there's a need for us to begin to think about what are the specific demands that our children have, and how is it that we can address their situations. There was another black intellectual psychologist named Dr. Naim Akbar, and he wrote a book called Visions for Black Men. And now there's a new version of it. I've never seen the new version. I know that the old version was extremely beneficial, in which he profiled different concepts that are out there in, at that time it was more, speaking directly to what was going on in the city life and city life in general, but you can still draw parallels to today's time. But he talked about the different visions that people had for being a man, and how some of these visions were undermining the whole concept of growing into maturity and being responsible. And so he himself also talked about the problem of surrendering our children to be educated and then expecting them to be able to do what it is that they need to do to mature and grow. Like, if we're surrendering our children to other people for them to educate them, and the educational philosophy that they have and the practices that they have don't address their needs, then how is it that we expect these children to be successful? We mentioned, and as a matter of principle, that the prophetic teaching teaches us that every child is born into a state of Islam, but then when that child encounters society, when it encounters adults, when it encounters the parents, then that child is transformed. And we know the hadith of the man who killed 99 men. And that hadith, one of the solutions to the problem of the murderer who was looking for repentance or forgiveness, one of the things that was recommended was that that person change their environment, as well as that person work on their relationship with God. Those are some indications that are there in the hadith in terms of meaning. And so when we look at environment and when we look at education, we find ourselves in a dilemma and in a problem, because what is necessary to address the crisis of the family is not in place. We have to begin to address the breakdown of the family on multiple levels. One of those levels is the way that these young boys have an understanding of themselves. The other issue is, why is it that they incline to certain actions and activities in the culture, in those environments that they live in, that happens to be the most destructive tendencies? Why don't they incline to certain aspects of the culture that will elevate them psychologically and emotionally and spiritually and intellectually and physically? Why do they incline to those practices which lead to destruction? These are the types of questions that we're not asking. And as Muslims that belong to 1400 years of reflection on revelation, we're not just starting from scratch. Muslims are people that historically have given birth to civilization. If we go back, we can find texts written in every science. If you look at the history of Muslims in West Africa by itself, if you look at the legacy of Timbuktu, which is a legacy of the African American community, we can say there's some tie-ins to it versus saying look at the legacy in Iraq or look at the legacy in India or like something that ties in even historically and by way of ancestors and cultures. In Timbuktu, they reached a level of thinking about education on how to deliver information in a way which was easy to memorize, fun, and so on and so forth. They talked about everything in Timbuktu, from psychology to music to mathematics. It was a way of life that was permeated, that was shaped, that was influenced by the values of being Muslim and by the idea that we believe in one God. Somewhere along the line, we've lost the idea that we need to have a culture in place which is able to speak to all dimensions of the human being. And we find that specifically we were to talk about just the black community, the non-Muslim black community is extremely advanced on dealing with these issues more so than the Muslim black community. Because when we look at people that were just mentioned, like Dr. Naeem Akbar, for instance, Dr. Amos Wilson, Jawaza Kunjufu, he was a pastor, or he was a practicing Christian. You find that in those communities, the church communities that are well established, they have some sort of system to deal with their youth. That's not to say that it's perfect, but they have a way to filter their youth. They bring them into the church, they bring them into jobs, they bring them into education, they help them get through the system. And I know of cases like that. I'm not just talking out of the thin air. I know what type of networks exist in those communities. And so somewhere along the line, that's not to say that the Muslims don't do that, but there's more of a breakdown in the Muslim community. We're dealing with more social breakdown in the Muslim community. And that has always been the case, because you find in many of our communities, unfortunately, and I'm not trying to single out and say that there's, associate poverty with the black community or social problems with the black community, but there's an element that needs to be addressed. Because here we're talking about what just took place in Philadelphia, and we're talking specifically about a family that basically is losing one of their youth, and we're talking about the fact that youth committed a crime against an elderly person from the black community, from the Philadelphian community, and why is it that we don't start to reflect on how to address our youth's real issues. And so, but we have to realize that our task in the Muslim community that deals with the black community is a lot different than what we find in the Christian community, because you find the Muslim community deals a lot head on with street culture. It deals a lot with those who have been incarcerated. It deals a lot with those who have some issues. And again, we don't want to stereotype and say that the whole of the black community is like that, because that is not the case at all. You have some well-established black families that don't have those types of elements within their circle, or that level of breakdown. Or if they have it, it's controlled. You know what I'm saying? Because in today's time, no family is unstruck or untouched by the social problems that we have in this society. No culture, no ethnic group. And people have to realize that there is stability within the black Muslim community. But when we start talking about these issues, they get generalized. But okay, so how are we going to deal with these types of issues? When we look at black leadership in the past, it directly was concerned with these types of issues. Unfortunately, black leadership in the Muslim community is, and when we start talking about da'wah, it's not addressing these issues head on. Right? The youth are our future, regardless of what cultural background they come from. Right? The youth are our future as a Muslim ummah. And specifically, the youth are our future if we're talking about, a particular tribal community. No tribe can continue to exist if their youth don't carry on the legacy, if their youth don't even, get to the point of safeguarding life. And one of the objectives of the Sharia is the issue of hifd al-nafs, is preservation of life. So what we're finding with our youth is that they're inclined to self-destruction and the destruction of life itself. And that's what we have to ask ourselves, what is going on that our youth are inclining in that direction? And what is it that we can do to be able to, yes, rescue these youth from these situations? I find that the non-Muslims and sometimes the Muslims that join with the non-Muslims are doing work in that regard. But the da'wah has to align itself with people that are focusing on addressing those types of issues. We can't do it alone. This is a social problem. It's bigger than a small group. It's bigger than a few individuals. The crisis of youth in this country is to be seen in white communities where youth go with automatic or semi-automatic weapons and they murder en masse. The crisis is seen with youth that are overdosing on drugs. The crisis is seen in the case of these youth that are just in the street roaming for whatever reason, conflict or whatever occurs, and they incline towards violence. It's a social problem, but specifically we have to be able to address things in a targeted way. There's no way that the Muslim community, and in specific the black Muslim community, can continue to take those types of blows and think that things are going to be okay. Just like society as a whole can't continue to take those types of blows wherein our youth in society, whether Muslim or non-Muslim, have these issues. You understand what I'm saying? So every community has to be working on this issue, whether Christian or whether atheist or whether Muslim, whatever it may be. At this point in time, we're talking about the issue just of safeguarding life. And for us, that's a matter of belief. So the issue of safeguarding life is on two fronts. One is the safeguarding of our own lives and the lives of others. Why is it that the youth are inclined to destruction, whether to suicide or to murder, homicide, that type of thing? And so my suggestion is that we begin to realize that the work that was being done in the past, in terms of being concerned with violence in the community, in terms of being concerned with family breakdown, in terms of being concerned with mental health, in terms of being concerned with spiritual flourishing, and so on and so forth. These are all things that Malcolm Al-Hajj Malik al-Shabazz, rahmatullahi alayhi, he focused on these issues. And it just seems that after Malcolm, things progressively got worse in this regard. Things became more and more violent at another extreme, with much more frequency, with much more effect and impact at a much larger scale. So it's within the legacy of the Muslim community itself and within the legacy of the non-Muslim community. We see that they carried on that legacy of people like Malcolm a little better than we have. But there's no doubt that we need to refocus on things like Boy Scouts. There was the Jawala Scouts at one point in time was a part of the Muslim orientation, and some have done a successful job at reintroducing some sort of system. Before, in the past, there was the idea of teaching martial arts, which allowed children to learn how to develop themselves physically, learn responsibility, and learn how to protect themselves and learn how to curb violence. There has to be something that we're doing that men are reintroducing themselves into the lives of young boys, because even if they have a father, having a father is not enough. Like there was the saying in the past, it takes a village to raise a child, and somewhere along the line that's completely gone. You understand what I'm saying? The idea that we need each other in order to sustain each other and preserve life itself. And so the da'wah should be focused on this, people. It should be focused on in this regard, because how can we talk about Tawheed if we're at a point where we don't even regard life? So the preservation of life and the focus on helping people value life takes a precedence. It's enough for people to learn the basics of La ilaha illallah Muhammad Rasulullah, and to learn in a general way the basics of who Allah is. But the priority has come now to the issue of what do you do with people that don't value life? What do you do with people that don't value life, and why don't they value life? That's the questions that we should be asking. And the deeper that we go into those questions, the more that we're going to be looking at trauma. The German Jewish psychologist Erich Fromm wrote on the issue of violence, and he actually had some study on it. And he talked about how violence a lot of times is the frustration of the human capacity to be creative. And so when their ability to be creative and be productive is frustrated, they turn to violence. And so if youth are frustrated, if youth are carrying emotions in which they don't feel valued, especially young boys, we have to admit, in some of our communities are devalued and emasculated and disoriented, and they are maligned on a regular basis. And so that leads them to the type of mindset which inclines towards destruction, because they themselves, what they feel about themselves is a hatred for themselves, because that's what they have internalized from the environment. And when it comes to single female-headed households, we know that at times that is a problem when it comes to the issue of young men and the raising of young men. We know that dynamic between mothers and sons doesn't always operate on a healthy level. And so we have to take the reins and begin to discuss these issues systematically, right? Systematically and in different ways, because every ethnic community is not going to be facing the same issue in the same way. And we have to be able to have open discussions on what it is that is going on in a manner which is going to help people engage the liberation process, liberating from all of those practices and ideas which stagnate the development of the human being, right? And that's the end goal of Islam. Leadership can't consider itself to be leadership if it's not concerned with the situations and the conditions and the realities of the Muslim community. And so the fact that this is a youth from our community as Muslims that engaged in this behavior in that community in Philadelphia specifically, it should be raising our eyes. It should be calling us to awaken. It should pause us to reflect. It should demand that we gather. It should push us to confer, to discuss the crisis in the state of our community. And more specifically, how it is that the da'wah, and more specific than that, education is failing us in addressing our real situations. This is not going to be solved by talks, people. Talks are only there to encourage and kind of shift the thinking in the culture, but we're going to have to look at this from the angle of what is it that can be done practically, immediately, and what is needed for the long term. And we're going to have to focus one community at a time, people. The Latino community has its needs. The African American community has its needs. The Palestinian community has its needs. And you can go on and on. Every community has a distinct set of needs, and sometimes we have overlapping needs. But we're seeing that we're losing our youth across the board. in different percentages, of course, but we're seeing the same problems across the board, across different ethnic communities, drugs, violence, so on and so forth, at different levels, but we're seeing it across the different ethnic groups. But in the case of the African American community, we mentioned this because it happened to be the case that the community of interest in Philadelphia in which this took place happened to be the African American community, right? And we know that there's a crisis with young men, but that crisis of young men doesn't only restrict itself to the African American community. It extends out to the Latino community, and we're starting to see the same thing in the Desi community, in urban centers. I've seen that when I was in Chicago, joining gangs. I've seen it in the Somali community in Minnesota, joining gangs, and we see it in some communities, in the Arab community in Patterson and other places like that in New Jersey. We see it in different areas, in different degrees, in different ways. So I don't want anyone to take from this that we're targeting a particular ethnic group to talk negatively or to highlight some negative points, because we're trying to break that frame and say that, no, that's not the case, that one specific community, like in this case, the African American community, is just plagued with problems. It just happens to be that within the African American community, within the Muslim African American community, there happens to be a segment which is struggling. But that doesn't characterize the whole of the community. And we say that from the heart and not out of political correctness. And we try to say that because we need to lay out a framework, the same way that those thinkers like Dr. Amos Wilson and Joaza Kunjufu and others, they laid out a framework to be able to deal with the problems that were plaguing the community at that time, specifically the African American community. And they allowed other people to build psychologies and counseling struggles, counseling orientations to deal with and address the struggle. So they pioneered for us the idea that we can't just take solutions from the larger society, but we have to make sure that those things that we're taking from the overall society are speaking to the conditions of our communities and their needs. And so the dawah has to shape itself in that way. So when we talk about youth problems, we have to talk about it from a multi-layered perspective. What's going on in the general society, what's going on in institutions, what's going on in the family, what's going on in a particular area, what's going on in the particular individual's history, and what's going on in those cultural communities. And so we have to have a layered, tiered approach to addressing issues when we analyze, so that our solution is targeted and directed to the actual needs of people. And if we can shape the dawah in that way, then we can begin to look at things from different perspectives. How is it that we collect our zakat money? How is it that we organize ourselves? How is it that we develop programming? How is it that we channel effort? How is it that our discourse or the way we talk about things, serve the cause of ensuring that we preserve our existence, preserve our deen, preserve our dignity, preserve our families, preserve, our wealth, and so on and so forth. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.